Hello, everyone. My name is Muriel Lanford. I work with Ransom Life Texas. We're a San Antonio-based nonprofit that serves minors who are victims and survivors of sex trafficking or other sexual exploitation. I'm the lead medical trainer. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you today. We are going to talk about human trafficking, what it is, what it isn't, and we're going to address some common misconceptions. We're all healthcare providers, and as such, we are actually one of the few professions likely to interact with trafficking victims while they're still being trafficked. I'll talk about how this happens a little later. Right now, I'd like you to meet some of the faces of human trafficking.
Human trafficking is slavery.
And it happens all over America.
Any child, any woman, any man could potentially become a victim of human trafficking.
I am a victim of labor trafficking.
I was victim of child sex trafficking, but now I own my body.
Human trafficking is any kind of forced labor.
It can happen to anybody.
I am a mother.
I am an author.
I am a son.
I'm an advocate.
I am an educator.
I'm a sister.
I am a brother.
I'm so much more than what happened to me.
I am strong.
I am brave.
I am outspoken.
I am compassionate.
I am a survivor.
I'm a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor of human trafficking.
Today, we're going to cover the major categories of human trafficking. We're going to differentiate it both from smuggling and consensual commercial sex. I'll talk about the scope of the problem, including the challenges with assessing that. We'll help you recognize various risk factors and red flags. And lastly, we'll discuss some appropriate patient-centered interventions. These are some key terms I'm going to cover today, and understanding what they mean in the context of human trafficking really is critical to interacting with victims and survivors. In fact, regarding those last two terms, note that an individual can go back and forth between the role of victim and survivor, sometimes multiple times. That is not uncommon. Before we go further, let's define what we're talking about. What exactly is human trafficking? Federal law defines human trafficking is called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We call it the TVPA. And the TVPA defines a trafficking victim as anyone induced to perform labor or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. That means force, fraud, or coercion must be proven in a court of law, except in the case of minors involved in commercial sex. If a minor is involved in commercial sex, it doesn't matter if they think they're doing it willingly. It doesn't matter if buyers didn't know they were underage. Any minor involved in commercial sex is automatically a human trafficking victim under federal law. Now, other than that exception I just mentioned, trafficking has to involve force or fraud or coercion. There are other types of exploitation, but one of those three factors must be present in order for it to be trafficking. Physical force is not typically the initial means of entry into trafficking. Although it's a common depiction in the media, what is much more common is fraud. Something is promised, it doesn't happen. The trafficker will typically maintain compliance through some type of coercion. This may be threats of violence to the victim or to their family member. I'm going to harm your parents. I'm going to do the same thing to your little brother or your little sister if you don't comply. Sometimes it's simply psychological manipulation. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just basic needs are often used by traffickers. Food and sleep are two common things that are used as coercive techniques to retain control. Bondage is where a victim's debt always exceeds their pay and they're never able to escape this ever-increasing debt cycle. And just a reminder, minors, commercial sex, we don't have to prove any of these. They are automatically human trafficking victims. In the state of Texas, there are 4 different types of human trafficking recognized: adult and minor labor trafficking, adult and minor sex trafficking. And I'll delve more into the distinction between labor and sex trafficking shortly. It is important not to confuse human trafficking with human smuggling, and the news media is actually getting better. I think most of you probably recall the horrific case from the San Antonio area in the summer of 22 because it made national news. A long-haul truck was discovered abandoned just south of town in the middle of the heat of summer of South Texas, and it was packed with individuals who had been brought across the border illegally without adequate food, water, or even ventilation. 53 human beings died. Now, most of the media got it right this time by reporting it as a horrible case of smuggling. This was an improvement from a very similar case that we had in 17, long-haul truck packed with individuals left in the heat, and people died. But at that time, a lot of the media outlets reported it as a horrific case of human trafficking. And we're like, no, it's not. It was another horrific case of smuggling. Well, what's the difference? Whether we're talking about weapons or drugs or people, smuggling is illegally transporting something across a border, whereas trafficking is illegally buying or selling something. In this case, we're talking about human beings or human services. To be clear, you do not have to be transported anywhere to be trafficked. Some victims are trafficked in their own home by caregivers and relatives, and sometimes, yes, even by parents. In fact, evidence of the prevalence of familial human trafficking, sadly. This is why it's often referred to as a modern day version of slavery. But is it a significant problem, or is it just kind of the issue of the day? It's a fair question, but as clinicians, we're used to being able to look at data, and that's the problem with human trafficking, data. A number of sources have tried to estimate the problem in the US, but organizations differ, methodologies differ. Statistics are literally all over the map. If you're looking for Texas statistics, this is a study that you will likely find. This was a seminal piece of work completed in 2016 and published in 2017 by the School of Social Work out of UT Austin. And these are the numbers that they came up with as estimates. Is it accurate today? Well, that's the problem with human trafficking data. The fact is we don't know what we don't know. There's some additional challenges with data. First, despite our efforts, there's still a lack of training and identification for every individual involved in the process dealing with human trafficking victims. That means healthcare providers, law enforcement, social service practitioners. We still have a long way to go. In identifying human trafficking victims, they're often not dealt with that part until it's much later when in criminal justice proceedings, when the courts are involved. Human trafficking as being a victim just doesn't get addressed till later. The nature of human trafficking itself can complicate identification, and then complicate it even more. Many victims don't even realize that they are trafficked or that they are victims. Therefore, the most significant limitation with human trafficking is that we only have data on cases that have been either reported or somehow otherwise discovered. How does human trafficking happen? It happens because of vulnerability. What causes vulnerability? Many victims, not all of them, but many victims start with adverse childhood experiences. And I think more and more clinical professionals are learning about ACEs. An adverse childhood experience may be someone who is homeless, food insecure, they live in poverty. Maybe there's a parent or a caregiver who's an abuser or an addict, or there's an incarcerated family member. Sometimes there's significant trauma or mental health issues in the home. All of these are examples of ACEs. If you're not familiar with ACEs, I encourage you to explore that research, because ACEs have been shown to independently have a profound influence on health outcomes. ACEs themselves can cause vulnerability, but you don't have to have any significant ACEs to be vulnerable. For labor trafficking, vulnerability is often due to a physical need. They need a job, they need to feed their family, they're seeking safety. Traffickers make promises to meet all those needs. With sex trafficking, in a way, we're all vulnerable when we're young. Think back to when you were a teenager. Virtually everyone at that age is looking for love and affection and romance and adventure. I was the adventure girl. Sex trafficking vulnerabilities may include obvious ACEs. They're a runaway, they're trying to escape abuse, but it also may be something as simple as a teenager who posts online, they just had a fight with their parent. They posted it online and now they are vulnerable. In fact, traffickers will often just manipulate human basic needs and human desires to create vulnerabilities, and that can easily happen in the absence of any ACEs at all. In all cases, what is key is accessibility. Whether we're talking about labor or sex trafficking, if someone is accessible, they're a potential victim, and if they're online, they're accessible. More on technology shortly. Other vulnerabilities, those with disability issues, anyone who or relationships, the LGBTQ and indigenous are particularly susceptible. Even faster, traffickers know how to take advantage of all of this. Let's talk about the difference between labor and sex trafficking. With labor trafficking, it has to involve force, fraud, or coercion, as does adult sex trafficking. But let's talk about labor trafficking and what it looks like in the state of Texas. These are some of the types of labor trafficking that we know have been prevalent in Texas over the past few years. Domestic work, sometimes called domestic servitude, which is very difficult to detect because it occurs in a private residence. Restaurants and food service are common places for forced labor. Housekeeping or cleaning services. This might be in a private business, a motel, or just being sent to different job sites. I don't know if any of you have seen the TV series, The Cleaning Lady. That could probably be called trafficking because there's definitely coercion involved. Agriculture is big business in the state of Texas. Groundskeeping, construction, landscaping, all of these are common places where forced labor takes place. I want to address a common misconception that I used to believe, and I've heard others still say this. Well, of course, trafficking is a big problem in Texas. We're close to the border. Not really. Foreign-born individuals, especially if they've recently arrived in the U.S., are at a greater risk for labor trafficking, but they can be from Africa or Asia or Eastern Europe just as easily as they can south of the border. They may answer an ad, they'll accept a job offer, and they'll make their way here legally. In fact, studies have shown that a majority of forced labor victims do enter the country legally. A common form of control by traffickers is to confiscate passports and visas, which the exploiter will claim, oh, it's for safekeeping. Well, then the victim fears deportation, even though they do have legal status. This was a medical professional couple, convicted in April of 24 of labor trafficking. She was a psychiatric NP. He is an MD, double-boarded psychiatrist, and also chairman of the board of trustees at his behavioral health center. They lured two individuals into the country legally with the promise of getting an education in America. When those individuals arrived here, the couple confiscated their passport and visa, respectively, and that's when the abuse began. And the NP was the primary abuser, both physically and psychologically, through isolation, degradation, constant surveillance, and threats not only to the victims, but to their children as well. But the physician and husband, even though he was less involved, he knew all about the abuse, and he was very happy to benefit from their labor and services. Again, they were convicted of labor trafficking. So you can't legally traffic your own children. This mother of four was forcing her children, ages 11 to 16, to work for her friend's cleaning service against their will. The kids were threatened with physical harm if they didn't comply, and when law enforcement found them, they were living in deplorable conditions. Both these women have been charged with labor trafficking. This was an interesting case from 19. This married Texas couple was indicted in Burnett County. They were running a supposed Christian nonprofit for troubled boys. Problem was, they were not only mistreating the boys, they were using them as free labor to make money for their lawn and moving business. Now, this was outside of Bertram. A lot of y'all probably haven't even heard of Bertram. This is why I find this interesting. Bertram's a town of about 1,500 people. It's less than an hour's drive from Austin. It's certainly not a big metro area. It's not even a suburban community. And my point is that human trafficking not only can, but it does occur everywhere. It occurs in small towns as well as big cities. It happens in wealthy neighborhoods as well as poor communities. Before we look at sex trafficking in Texas, I want to address a disparity that we often see between sex and labor trafficking. If you notice from the UT statistics, and this has been echoed by other sources, most sources consider labor trafficking to be a much bigger problem. Why don't we hear much about it? Why does sex trafficking get all the attention? There are a few reasons. When you conjure up images of sexual exploitation of children, it's just horrific. For most of us, it's just hard to get our head around. So it gets more compassion, more media attention, and usually more resources. Labor trafficking tends to be more insidious. Victims are less likely to outcry or be discovered for several reasons. If they're foreign-born, they're in a country where they may or may not have a good command of the language. Maybe they're not familiar with our justice system and don't know that we have laws to protect even non-citizens from this type of abuse. Maybe they don't trust law enforcement due to circumstances back home. If being trafficked is their only source of income, they may fear losing that despite the circumstances. Victims may just feel that they don't have any recourse, or they may fear deportation even more, especially if the trafficker has confiscated a visa or passport. For all these reasons, prosecution of these cases is more difficult as well. And unfortunately, labor trafficking sometimes gets mixed up in political discussions, immigration policy, all those things. Labor trafficking and sex trafficking can occur concurrently in the same setting. We do sometimes see that. And looking at current trends in Texas over the past few years, these are some examples of sex trafficking that we've seen commonly across the state. Escort services, personal sexual servitude, motel, hotel, residence-based commercial sex, sexually related activity in strip clubs, and illicit massage and spa businesses. But I want to point out one other thing about pornography. Since 2021, pornography has been the second most common reason for calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because porn is a common avenue for sex trafficking. Personally, I used to see porn as pretty much a victimless crime. But now we know the fact is online porn is often forced. It's not voluntary, and it's not going to appear forced. You're not going to be able to tell by looking at it. So it's good to be aware that when viewing porn, sometimes that click of the mouse is actually supporting human trafficking. Every time that mouse gets clicked, that's money for a trafficker oftentimes. Speaking of porn, this is a term that needs to go away. There is no such thing as child pornography. It is child sexual abuse material. That is the term that's now used. This also includes AI-generated material and deepfakes. And sadly, it's getting more difficult to distinguish these from the real thing. If you see the abbreviation CSAM, this is what it means. The phrase child pornography is still present in existing laws, but this is now the preferred term, and I hope that we will see that transition out of our lexicon. I want to clarify the distinction between sex trafficking and consensual commercial sex or prostitution. Basically, one is voluntary and the other is not. However, that is an oversimplification. It's not always that clear cut. Are they controlling their own money and schedule without any force or fraud or coercion? If so, then it's probably not human trafficking. Males, boys and young men who engage in what we call survival sex are more likely than females to operate independently. But if there is a pimp involved, that pimp is often a trafficker. Is the pimp controlling the money? Are they using physical abuse or threats to exert control? Are any of the workers not allowed to eat or sleep until they make a certain quota? Are any of the minors? If that's the case, that's all trafficking. Interesting study done in 2008 surveyed more than 800 prostitutes. The vast majority, nearly 90%, said that they were in that profession only because they felt they had no other option to survive except that life. Prostitution is usually not as glamorous as entertainment media sometimes makes it out to be. What's my point? We sometimes see young people start out making sexually explicit content online just to make some extra cash or maybe even helping fund their education, but they're unaware that that frequently ends with exploitation. This is an interesting study out of San Diego County. Researchers went back and pulled 2 years worth of all their prostitution cases. When they went back and re-examined them, they found that fully half of those cases met the federal criteria for human trafficking. They just hadn't been looking at it through that lens. Now we know there's likely more trafficking and less prostitution going on than is readily apparent. And that has made me look at these patients a little bit differently, and maybe it will for you as well. It's widely believed the most prevalent form of sex trafficking in the States, in the US, is sex trafficking of children. And you may see a number of different terms used, but they all have they all have similar meanings. Sex trafficking of minors. What exactly is child sex trafficking? Basically, it's a seller making money by selling a product to a buyer, except the product in this case is a human being, a US citizen most of the time, who is underage. What qualifies as commercial sex? It's anything of a sexual nature where someone is receiving money or something of value. It may be food, rent, shelter, even drugs. If something of value is being exchanged for sexual services, that's commercial sex. And that may involve taking pornographic images, making online videos. It may be porn. It may be stripping at a club. It may be an actual sex act. In fact, when a minor is involved in commercial sex, the buyer is also legally guilty of human trafficking. Think about it this way. If they're paying to have sex with a minor, they're paying to rape a child. It's also trafficking. Speaking of those buyers, sex trafficking wouldn't exist if there were no demand. So who's buying and using these services? I kind of like to think it's a creepy guy who lives in the beat up trailer on the edge of town. It'll break your heart, but it's much more likely to be closer to home. It's more likely to be our neighbors, our peers, possibly the person sitting next to me in church. All of these are examples of professions who have either paid to exploit or even rape a minor. Child prostitution is an oxymoron. This is another phrase that needs to go away. If a minor cannot consent to sex, how can they consent to prostitution? They cannot. Thus, the exception for minors in federal trafficking law. Just as with labor trafficking, in the case of sex trafficking, the border is almost irrelevant. But unlike labor trafficking, far more sex trafficking victims are US citizens, not foreign born. It's just as big a problem in Kansas or Kentucky or as it is any other state, as it is the border states, including Texas. It's a big problem everywhere. The border is just not a big factor. Now, do people get smuggled across the border and then get sex trafficked? Yes, that does happen occasionally, and it's absolutely a risk with unaccompanied minors. It still pales in comparison to the primary problem. So if we focus on the border, we actually miss the bigger issue because it's primarily our young people. It's our kids. Let's talk about the traffickers and how human trafficking actually happens. I want to address another common misconception about sex trafficking. Some of you probably saw the original movie Taken. I did because I'm a big fan of Liam Neeson. If you didn't see it in the original movie, Liam Neeson's teenage daughter gets kidnapped during travel and ends up being sex trafficked. Well, the movie was well done. Liam did a great job, as he always does. But unfortunately, that was a way that a lot of the public, quote, learned about sex trafficking. And the problem is, it's just not reality in the US. It's very rare. When kidnapping occurs in the US, it's usually a non-custodial parent taking a child. But in the unusual case, and it is uncommon, when kidnapping occurs for exploitation, it's almost always for that one person's abuse or exploitation, as opposed to kidnapping them and renting them or selling them to third parties. Sex trafficking is not about the creepy guy in the white panel van snatching kids out of the parking lot or off the playground. It's just not how they work. Now, do predators? Yes, but traffickers, no. Why? It's a terrible business model. With traffickers, it's all about the money. Why would they take the risk when it's not only much easier, but it's far more lucrative to lure someone online, create a relationship, and then the victim goes with their exploiter willingly? When you think about it, that white panel van is already in your home. It's on their cell phone. It's on that laptop or that tablet or any other internet devices. And this is why educating kids against stranger danger is not effective for sex trafficking prevention. NCMEC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There are Amber Alert people. And NCMEC estimates that about 90% of all minors who are missing actually go with their exploiter willingly because they know them or think they know them. They met them online. Traffickers may target young people any place where they hang out. It may be school sporting events, a theater, a mall, but the most common place is still online because it's just so easy. What do traffickers look like? Get a picture in your head, and I'll show you some actual traffickers. You probably know a fair number of these. I think everyone recognizes Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. As you know, Epstein died in prison while awaiting human trafficking charges. Maxwell was found guilty of sex trafficking and sentenced to 20 years. And when sentencing, the judge described her case as horrific and having caused incalculable harm to her victims, not just his. Keith Raniere ran a, quote, self-improvement group called NXIVM. He was convicted of trafficking in 19, but I found the people who worked with him even more interesting. Some of you may recognize Allison Mack. She was a popular actress for a while. She wasn't convicted of human trafficking. She pled to lesser charges, but she admitted to procuring young women for Mr. Raniere to sexually exploit. Claire Bronfman is heiress to the Seagram's fortune. She also was convicted of lesser charges in the organization, but she was helping finance the whole thing. You probably heard in September of 24, Sean Combs, or P. Diddy, was charged with sex trafficking, among several other things as well. And then R. Kelly was also convicted of sex trafficking. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. More of his victims were minors. This one's a little bit closer to home. Alan Lee was a 26-year-old physician. He was arrested for attempted sex trafficking because he stated online in writing that he wanted to rent minors for sex, preferably, I quote, 8 to 15 years old. Think about the 8-year-olds you know. Now, you may not know any of these traffickers, but they're all from our backyard. These are all Texas cases. In fact, if you had lived in San Antonio for a while, you might recognize Mark Benavides because he was a prominent defense attorney here in town for a number of years. He even ran for judge at one point. But in 18, he was convicted on multiple counts of human trafficking. He was sentenced to 80 years. What got him 80 years? Who was he trafficking? Some of his clients who couldn't pay. Oh, you can't pay? No big deal. I got something for you on the side you can do. This high school teacher and her son were charged with recruiting students for prostitution, minors for prostitution, that's commercial sex. This couple ran a restaurant in Waco along with 2 other individuals. They were using Chinese connections to bring workers in from China and forcing them to work for no pay. These 3 men in the Odessa area were caught during a human trafficking investigation in a room with a 14-year-old female. They ended up not being charged with trafficking, but were charged with sexual exploitation. Lastly, though, I want you to meet the former Businesswoman of the Year for the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Yep. Adriana Rodriguez ran a bilingual school, and she promised all her employees They'd get legal status, great pay, good career, didn't happen. She's been under investigation for a while for labor trafficking in Texas. Look at these pictures. These are great examples of just how diverse perpetrators can be. You have a prominent attorney, a teacher, an actress, an heiress, a physician. We have wealthy, influential people, or just the neighbor next door. I can't tell you what traffickers or people who associate them with them look like, because these were all somebody's neighbor. How do traffickers work? Very simple. They target people's needs or wants. And this may be physical needs, or sometimes just psychological or emotional needs or desires. I think everybody learned about Maslow in school, and our hierarchy of needs, I know, has been debated, but the core concepts are still true. Our very basic needs are physiologic. We have strong needs for safety, and we all want to belong and feel loved. Traffickers are usually very practiced at identifying a person's vulnerable areas and targeting those areas, generally near the bottom part of that pyramid. Labor lures. Lure for labor trafficking, as I mentioned, is usually a physical need. They need a job. They need a living wage to feed their family. Sometimes they're seeking shelter and safety, sometimes just a better life. And various techniques may be employed, such as online ads, word of mouth, labor recruiters who aren't really, or just false promises. Go back and remember that medical professional couple I just mentioned? They promised their forced labor victims a legal pathway to America. That's how they entice them. Sex trafficking, whether it's online or in person, lure for sex trafficking, especially with minors, is often the grooming process. It's a very important component in child sex trafficking. In fact, when it comes to trafficking children, this is usually a very methodical process that traffickers are very practiced at. Initially, traffickers will target vulnerabilities. As we talked about earlier, this may be someone with a true need or someone just looking for romance or adventure. The traffickers then try to gain their trust through casual conversations, promises of friendship or romance. Victims may respond to someone who they think understands them or gets them or just listens to them. The trafficker then determines what it is that potential victim wants or needs, and they're going to provide it. Is it attention? Is it nice gifts? Is it escape from a bad environment? Is it just romance and adventure? Maybe it's a new game on the market or that cool pair of shoes that everybody wants. As the trafficker cultivates that relationship of trust, filling all their needs and wants, they're going to slowly start isolating the victim. And after successful isolation, typically only then is abuse introduced, because by now it's tolerated. By now the victim thinks, this is my friend or my romantic partner, or they just don't see a way out. When this happens, the process is complete and the trafficker really has complete control. This is why between lures and grooming, education of our young people and ourselves is critical. Arm those kids with knowledge. It will help them avoid being a target or a victim. How does technology factor into human trafficking? Well, everything I've just talked about has been made a lot easier by technology, and traffickers are typically experts at exploiting tech. Through online ads, labor trafficking victims will get lured with promises of work, great pay, better life, a legal pathway to the US. Sex trafficking victims will get lured with false flattery, romance, promises of money, fame, travel, adventure, again, or just attention. If someone hasn't been the talk of the town, this can be especially appealing. Think about the kid who's bullied at school or just doesn't fit in or maybe is new to the community. That can make this particularly attractive. While social media can be used to entice labor trafficking targets with offers of employment and such, it's especially effective for sex trafficking of minors. Think about it. These days, many of our kids are just documenting their lives online, and it's pretty easy for exploiters to follow their target online and figure out what it is they want, what it is that they are looking for. There is another common misconception in sexual exploitation or sex trafficking, that it happens primarily to females, and that's not the case. Multiple sources in the past few years have shown us that we've probably underestimated the exploitation of boys significantly. In fact, one of our local experts is a federal agent who has dedicated his decades-long career to sexual exploitation investigations. He now assists our local sheriff as a Fed. And he said for years, his ratio of boys to girls in investigations is about 50-50. With girls, traffickers are more likely to use the grooming process. With boys, gaming apps with messaging features, typically popular routes for boys who are targeted for trafficking or exploitation. However, boys can be groomed, and we are seeing more girls involved in gaming. A predator will often pose as a peer and befriend the minor. This will often develop into what we call sextortion. It's another predatory tool that has evolved from technology, and it plays a significant role in the exploitation of minors. Think about it, minors will often share sexually oriented images without really thinking about the consequences. According to the FBI, there's been an explosion of sextortion cases in the last few years, targeting children specifically. I'm going to show you a quick video that will give you a little bit of an overview about this problem.
FBI field offices across the country have reported an increase in youth sextortion cases where sexually explicit content is used as blackmail. Stephanie Sy reports on the concerning trend and preventive efforts to protect minors.
Social media has become fertile ground for scammers to target young people, and in some cases, the consequences have been deadly. In a 2-year period between October 2021 to March 2023, the FBI received over 13,000 reports of online financial sextortion of minors. It impacted 12,600 victims and led to at least 20 suicides. FBI Special Agent Emily Steele joins us from the Phoenix field office with more on what the dangers of sextortion are and what parents can do to prevent it. Agent Steele, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour. First of all, give me a sense of how prevalent this crime has become and why the FBI is especially concerned about young people.
This crime has become significantly more prevalent, especially with younger children's access to technology. So whether it be receiving an iPad or a Chromebook from school that has internet connection, or even just availability of getting on a parent's phone and using social media, kids are learning younger and younger how to navigate through the internet and online social media world, and that's creating more victims for predators.
Okay, so this is happening, I understand, through social media. How exactly are these people luring children in through these platforms? How does it work?
You know, it can be described in a long or short process, but the short process is children are vulnerable and children are everywhere online and not using proper security techniques on their social media. So say, for instance, they have an Instagram, it's not set to private and anyone can follow them and see what they're doing on their day-to-day activity. So if a child posts on their Instagram story, for instance, that they're in school and they're taking pictures with their friends, well, then a predator instantly knows that this is a minor because they are in school. From there, it can be as easy as sending a direct message and complimenting the minor, or pretending to be a minor from the opposite sex and asking for nude photos. And unfortunately, it happens very quickly. It's not a long process or a long drawn out relationship. It can happen in a matter of minutes that they are convincing these children to send nude or explicit photos and videos of themselves.
Consequences she mentioned can be dire. Boys and young men tend to be especially susceptible due to the shame and their reluctance to tell anyone. These are just a handful of young men who have taken their lives after being sextorted online, some within hours of the initial contact. And we used to tell kids that once their image was out there, there was no hope of getting it back, but now there is hope. NCMEC actually has a Take It Down program that can help remove online explicit images and videos if they were taken before the age of 18. So educate those kiddos in your life. These are examples of just a few of the recent bipartisan cases of federal law attempting to protect children online. Report Act, COSA Act, COPPA Act. I'm not going to cover all these because we don't know how they're going to play out. And as awareness increases, I expect that there will be more attempts at this. Texas has passed several laws related to human trafficking in the most recent legislative sessions. And again, these are just a handful of those laws. Soliciting a prostitute is now a state jail felony. Why? Because as I stated previously, what looks like prostitution may actually be human trafficking. I mentioned that grooming is a common component in sexual exploitation of minors. It is now a third-degree felony. However, a number of legal entities are challenging this law because they think it's too vague. We'll see how that plays out, but at least it's a start. Strangulation during the commission of interpersonal violence is now an enhancement to the penalties. It now makes all the penalties worse. Recent studies have shown that a significant percentage of sex trafficking victims get strangled or asphyxiated during their abuse. So we hope This will help up the penalties on those traffickers and exploiters. Where do we come in? What role do we have as healthcare providers? First, I want you to be aware that you may be interacting with human trafficking victims right now. This 2014 study is a bit dated, but it's still often quoted. It was a seminal study at the time. 88% of the trafficking victims surveyed in this study had seen a healthcare provider while they were still being trafficked and were not identified as potential victims. Now, it was a valid study, but only addressed adult female sex trafficking victims. It didn't include children or males or labor trafficking victims. Statistics in the healthcare settings are going to vary, and as we mentioned earlier, human trafficking statistics are slippery. The important takeaway is just be aware that they may be present in more practice settings than you might initially consider. For instance, at schools, it's not just in the classroom, it's the athletic field, the nurse's office, dental offices, clinics, urgent care centers, residential treatment centers, emergency centers, private physician offices, all types of clinical therapy settings. Why are we as healthcare providers in a position to intervene? You may or may not be aware, but for over 2 decades now, healthcare professionals have been ranked as the most trusted professions in the US, even during COVID. People trust us. That puts us in a unique position. You know that human trafficking, what it is, it's a problem in our backyard, and hopefully you know now that victims often intersect with us as healthcare providers. The next logical question would be, well, how would I know if I encounter a victim? We're going to discuss that in this section, but before we discuss specific indicators and red flags, let's get rid of our stereotypes. Victims are not just young people. Don't forget to consider labor trafficking, which occurs at any age. And again, both males and females are sex and labor trafficked. Victims are not just immigrants and foreigners. In fact, sex trafficking victims are much more likely to be US citizens. It's not just the poor or disadvantaged or abused who are victims. While they are often more vulnerable, all socioeconomic groups can be affected, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking. At our organization, we focus on sex trafficking and exploitation of minors, and we've provided services to every zip code in the metro area, every socioeconomic strata. Some kids, yes, are from vulnerable situations, but we sometimes see victims from healthy families who are good in school and active in church, but they have gotten lured online. If you interact with patients and clients, you will likely interact with victims and survivors. So what do they look like? Think about it kind of in the same way as we're taught about universal precautions. We're taught to treat everyone's bodily fluid as potentially infectious. Well, kind of in that same vein, consider the possibility that any of your patients may be a victim. Any man, any woman, every boy, every girl, make it a possibility because we don't know what they're going to look like. Knowing that, what should you look for? Another challenge with discussing indicators for trafficking is they're difficult to cover because they don't fit into nice, neat, discrete little categories by themselves. There is crossover between indicators for trafficking and other possible causes. So as we go through these indicators, I'm going to ask you to do a simple exercise. When we cover some of these, I want you to make a mental note of any that you wouldn't have thought about, any that surprised you that you didn't know, but especially any that would make you personally suspect trafficking as a possibility if you saw it in your practice setting. Some indicators are going to be easier to spot if you are performing a physical exam, if that's part of your role. And most red flags typically fall into one of these ABCs: their appearance, their behavior, or the communication. And quite frankly, even if it's not trafficking, if your spidey sense is telling you something's not right, typically someone needs help. All I'm asking is that you keep trafficking in your differential. Your appearance. These findings are too familiar to some of us. Signs and symptoms of neglect and abuse, wounds in various stages, unexplained injuries. Victims are often trained to tell lies or scripted stories to avoid detection. My background's in trauma. I have found if the story doesn't match the clinical picture, one or more of these factors is usually involved. Some type of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, substance abuse, or some other criminal activity. In addition, any untreated medical issues, either acute or chronic, or indications of delayed medical treatment, because neglected medical issues can be signs of control by another party. But it can also be due to poverty or someone with mental health issues. That can confound the picture. Just be alert, be a little bit suspicious. They may appear particularly malnourished or in poor health. Make that an indicator for you as well. You may see acute or chronic physical findings, trauma, may be old or new or a mix of old and new. GI issues may be chronic or it may be something acute. Poor dental health or even oral or dental injuries may be evident if you look for them. In the medical setting, headache is a common chief complaint that gets them in the door. Don't automatically write off that headache if you see other suspicious indicators. Abdominal pain is another common chief complaint. Their behavior, are they a poor historian? Are they avoiding eye contact? Do they have a flat affect or appear depressed? Are they withdrawn or fearful? Maybe you see hypervigilance or subordination. I mentioned that traffickers will often retain ID as a form of control, especially if it's a passport or visa. That alone can create fear and an unwillingness to engage, and you may see that. Sometimes they're unable to provide a residential address for the front desk. Oh, I'm just visiting, I'm not passing through, I'm not really staying anywhere. Victims just may not know what town they're in, believe it or not. You don't have to be transported to be trafficked. We talked about that earlier, but some labor and sex trafficking victims are intentionally taken on what is called the circuit. They're intentionally taken to different locations and job sites to work. For instance, labor trafficking victims in agriculture may have to follow different harvests. Sex trafficking victims may be forced to follow major events. But as I mentioned before, many victims don't even recognize themselves as victims. So that's an issue as well. Communication. Be especially mindful of nonverbal cues. If the patient is especially submissive to the person with them, and this controlling or domineering adult may be older than they are, but it also might be somebody closer in age to them that they claim, oh, this is my sister or my cousin or my brother-in-law. And that person may be the trafficker, but often it's just somebody working with them or for them who has also been threatened. Make sure you don't get found out. We've all seen patients or clients with controlling partners or family members, and where that person tries to control the conversation and doesn't allow the patient to speak for themselves. As good clinicians, we encourage that patient to respond for themselves, but watch their reaction when they do. Do they seem nervous or a little bit fearful? Do they keep glancing at the other person as if they're trying to say the right thing or stick to the script? That can be a clue. Sometimes you may see inappropriate contact with them and the person with them. With any of these things, just consider the possibility that it might be trafficking. Social media has made this a universal hand signal for I need help. Open palm, thumb inside, fingers down. And they'll probably do it up close to their body where the person with them can't see. So if you see someone doing that, they're trying to communicate, I need help. These indicators are more specific to labor trafficking. Do you happen to discover they live where they work? If they don't own the business, that may be a red flag. Now, as practitioners, we don't know whether someone has their ID, but your front desk personnel needs to be alert that that is a potential red flag and know that it's important to relay that information to you as the provider. Is there a language barrier? Have they recently arrived in the US? These are all risk factors. Victims may be fearful of authorities like law enforcement. This certainly can be true of sex trafficking when a victim wants help, but fears being found out and the repercussions. But typically, labor trafficking victims typically have the greater fear of deportation, especially if a trafficker has confiscated their documents. As I said, most of them are here legally, but don't have access to their documents. But if they're undocumented, obviously that's going to make them fearful also. Perhaps they fear losing their only source of income, no matter how brutal the conditions, especially if they're trying to feed children. Maybe you see signs of dehydration or exhaustion or untreated injuries that you suspect could be work-related. Perhaps they have an injury that could reflect unsafe or even dangerous conditions that you think would be unlikely in the age of OSHA. Say a worker comes in, depending on what your place of business is, but say you have someone come in with serious trauma and they don't have any ID, my boss has it, and I don't know his name, I don't know how to contact him, and they seem to have a language barrier, they seem to not know what you're talking about with workers' rights. All those would add up to one big red flag to me. When you're assessing your patient, consider the possibility of environmental exposures, even if they don't report that it's work-related. For instance, what would you expect to see if someone is working in an enclosed space with toxic chemicals, without adequate ventilation and no PPE? Think about the signs and symptoms you would see. Or what if they have signs of excessive sun exposure? They seem to have chronic musculoskeletal issues and perhaps respiratory issues. Well, these may reflect unsafe conditions in an agricultural setting. If it's a minor, consider signs that they may be in a work setting for which they're too young. So injuries in a minor may indicate abuse, but consider they also may be signs of illegal child labor. And even if it's not trafficking, it still could be other types of child exploitation. These are more specific to sex trafficking. And I want to make a point here because I'm kind of talking to myself. If we're not considering exploitation in our differential, it's very easy to misinterpret certain signs. It can be easy to categorize these people as hookers or frequent flyers or drug users or delinquents. I have certainly been guilty of that in my career. Is their attire, the behavior overly sexual for their age? It can be easy to write that off to promiscuity if we're not thinking beyond that. Do they look younger than their stated age? Or maybe inappropriate clothing for the weather. It's August and they're all covered up. It's February and it's freezing, but they have nothing on. They may come across as overly confident or even brash as a protective mechanism. I may interpret that as someone with an attitude, when instead I need to be thinking beyond that to what's going on here. Tattoos can be a key red flag, and they may be obvious or they may be hidden. But common signs of ownership, and this can be true sometimes in gangs, but sometimes in trafficking too, they will often get branded. The word daddy, a crown, money symbols, or other symbols of power, these are all typical signs of ownership. Do they have more than one phone? Do they seem especially nervous or fearful when they can't immediately answer a text or call? That can be a red flag. Sex traffickers will often use drugs as a means of manipulation and control, even if the victim wasn't taking drugs initially. Sex trafficking, they probably are now. Have they come in for multiple STIs, or you feel like you found that they've been treated for multiple sexually transmitted infections? Or maybe they've had an abortion at an early age or multiple unwanted pregnancies. Maybe they've had multiple visits for GYN procedures or problems. That can be, again, very easy to write all this off to prostitution or promiscuity. Think about the possibility of trafficking. And even if it's not trafficking, it could be other exploitation. I mentioned earlier that studies have shown strangulation and asphyxiation are often associated with sex trafficking. Look at their neck. Do you see signs of finger or hand imprints? Do you see petechial hemorrhage, other signs of trauma? Anything on their neck. I've already mentioned the possibility of dental trauma. This is with any clinical sign or symptom. It's really easy to write off one particular finding. Sometimes it requires putting them all together to see that there's a pattern. And keep in mind, if you work in a place where you see repetitive visits from the same person, you may not see those red flags. They may not become apparent till the third or fourth or 10th visit, sometimes even months later. Now, I know I've covered a lot of information in the last few minutes. There's certainly a lot of indicators to consider. Sometimes there are none. This was a young lady that just happened to be discovered during the UT study, and she said to the public, there was nothing wrong with me. I was very active in school and sports and theater, and her traffickers made her continue those activities, but they also controlled her phone and her social media to make it appear that nothing in her life had changed. People who are being trafficked are not always missing. Some of them go home every day, and this is especially true of familial trafficking. Possible long-term consequences of trafficking are numerous. Time prevents us from covering these in depth, but we'll just touch on a few. First, you have the physical consequences. Think about all the effects of chronic, repetitive, or untreated disease and illness or injuries. For anyone who experiences repetitive trauma, they keep releasing cortisol. Persisting cortisol release leads to a host of problems. First, serotonin suppression. Well, that helps us feel good. So if serotonin keeps getting suppressed, that can contribute to anxiety or agitation. Cortisol release also affects metabolism, glucose control. Think about your diabetics. It suppresses the immune system. It affects digestion, making GI issues more likely. Ultimately, it can even become toxic to certain brain cells. The hippocampus is particularly susceptible because of its role in cortisol modulation. I mentioned sleep deprivation as a common means of control for victims. Well, guess what? Sleep deprivation further increases cortisol production. The lack of nutrition makes them more susceptible to illness, less likely to heal well. And for sex trafficking victims, sexual dysfunction or irreparable reproductive damage will sometimes occur. Now, in addition to all these long-term physical problems, victims often develop cognition and learning barriers, and even executive function impairment. Remember, executive functions, all those parts of the brain affecting judgment, rational thought, emotional regulation, communication, all those things we expect them to be engaging to communicate with us. Well, if their trauma has occurred to the developing brain, that can hijack development of those executive functions. Self-medication is common in this population, and there are multiple effects on mental health. In fact, poor mental health is not only a dominant, but it is a persistent adverse health effect associated with human trafficking. Depression is very common in this population. PTSD is prevalent, as well as eating and anxiety disorders. But another long-term mental health consequence can be trauma bonding. This is a psychological bond with their exploiter. More on that in just a moment. No, human trafficking is a problem. Hopefully you have a few more clues on how to identify it. What do you do with that information? Before we talk about specific interventions, we have to address some barriers. This is important. Recognize your own potential barriers. We all have them. Everything I'm going to show you here, these are all suggestions from survivors because these are things they have experienced. One of the biggest barriers I've encountered since giving these talks is people believe it really won't happen in their practice setting. And I fell prey to this thinking. The first time I gave this talk was to a group of physical therapists. And I remember thinking, are they going to be going to physical therapy if they're being trafficked? I was thinking it probably wouldn't apply to them, but I know they have to have it. Well, I got schooled because the next day we got a call from the owner and she said, thank you. The training was very timely. We identified a victim in our practice today. Again, I was humbled. So this really taught me I need to pay attention to my own advice. I have had people who worked in faith-based schools, affluent environments, say, yeah, I know we have to have it, but it's not really relevant for me. Victims have been identified in those settings, trust me. In all these cases, we have to resist our stereotypes, and we also have to watch our affect and our body language. Regardless of your role or how busy you are, I know for some of us, we may have 2 minutes to establish a relationship of trust and cooperation. It doesn't take any extra time to smile or to look your patient in the eye or just be kind. In fact, I cannot overstate the importance of simple kindness for these individuals. Please avoid a judgmental approach. And I don't think any of us do this intentionally, but I can say for myself, when I get busy at work, I can get in the zone and I may come across short or abrupt without realizing it. And I need to be careful about that. Remember that survey of sex trafficking survivors that I just talked about a moment ago? 88% of them said, yeah, we saw a healthcare provider and nobody asked us anything or identified us. Well, the surveyor said, so why didn't you self-disclose? Why didn't you say something? The biggest barrier, the vast majority of them said they felt judged by the healthcare provider. Think about how often we talk about or treat the frequent flyer or the drug user or the delinquent. Everyone has a story, whether we know their story or not, everyone has one. I want you to think about a personal experience that you've had, say at a restaurant or a store where you didn't like the way that you were treated and you thought, I'm not going back there again. That was likely because of poor customer service, right? Think about an issue this personal, this sensitive, and if you felt judged or disrespected or even a lack of compassion, why would you ever go back? You wouldn't. We must create a safe environment for them. Remember, Maslow's safety is right after physiological needs. And I know we're supposed to screen for everything, but again, it doesn't take any time to just be aware and to act kindly. Those are huge. Not always easy to identify victims because they have barriers as well. As I mentioned earlier, many don't even recognize that they are victims. And it's not uncommon for many of them to have been mislabeled as criminals instead of victims. And if that happens, they're not likely to trust authority. Many victims feel the situation is their fault. They're ashamed. And this is very common with the young survivors we work with. Some have resigned themselves to this life as their only option. Their exploiters have often told them you're not good for anything else. So they already feel hopeless. Many don't feel like they deserve anything better. And then there's the trauma bonding. When there's ongoing control or abuse within a relationship, a trauma bond can form. When there's an uneven power dynamic and the victim's either physically, but more often psychologically unable to escape, they have to develop a way to survive. And this explains why victims will often have feelings of trust or even affection for their abuser. And it's important for us to understand that this is a survival strategy. Some of you probably have heard the term Stockholm Syndrome. If you haven't, decades ago in Stockholm, Sweden, hostages in a bank robbery were detained for several days. And during those few days, some of the hostages bonded with their captors enough that they not only refused to testify against them, they defended them in court. Some even kept up with them after the incident. Think about that. A trauma bond occurred in a matter of days with hostages. People who are basically kidnapped by strangers in a hostile situation. Now consider that many of our traumatized victims start out believing that their abuser or exploiter is someone they love or trust, a romantic partner, a friend, or even a parent. So it's not a big leap to see how they might stay loyal to them. We all want to be treated kindly. If it's in short supply, the victim's going to hang on to whatever little kindness they can get, however small that kindness, some is better than none. We all want to be loved. For sex trafficking victims, breaking free of that trauma bond may mean letting go of the fantasy of being loved. Traffickers are very good at the deliberate development of these trauma bonds. They will alternate just small acts of caring and kindness just now and then, and they will alternate that with lots of threats and abuse, and that keeps that trauma bond intact. Beyond recognizing barriers, what is our role as healthcare providers in this situation? Well, obviously it depends on your role or your position at your organization, but it goes without saying that interventions with potential victims or survivors should always be patient-centered, trauma-informed, and evidence-based. What should you do? Before we get to that, before you answer that, we can answer that question, I want you to try to find out the answer to these questions. Does your organization or your practice have something in place? Whether it be a policy or a simple protocol? Is a screening tool available with the training to go with the tool? Do you know how to access sexual assault nurse examiners? Or perhaps it may be the Rape Crisis Center when needed. Well, you may have some or none of those resources, but what is critical is establishing trust and rapport. If you do have a protocol, the answer is straightforward. Follow it. Use the resources you have. Many of you will not have anything in place, not even a simple protocol. That might be a starting point for you or someone in your organization, and it can be something very simple. It could be something as simple as, here are the indicators, this is what you do, these are the resources that we have. Use a trauma-informed approach. Now, I've used that term a couple of times now, but what does it actually mean? Trauma-informed care is not just the latest buzz phrase in patient care. It is a victim-centered approach, and it's evidence-based practice for working with trauma victims and survivors. It's been shown to make a difference. The primary guiding principle in trauma-informed care is safety. Above all, the goal is to avoid re-traumatization, and that includes not blaming or criminalizing the victim. I'm going to show you a short video of someone who will tell you about that.
When you are vulnerable, it really shows up in your body and your health. And human trafficking victims are definitively some of the most vulnerable people in our community and some of the most vulnerable people that we are going to treat in the healthcare system. My name is Julie Maxon. I'm a social worker and manager of our care coordination department. At least half of trafficked individuals come into contact with the healthcare industry at some point during their trafficking experience. And we hear from survivors repeatedly that in their contacts with the healthcare system, they did not disclose that they were being trafficked, even when asked by someone that they trusted and knew was there to care for them. They will adamantly deny it and deny it as though their life depends on it. And it does. If we can help our providers all understand that those are also signs and symptoms of being in a trafficked situation, we can understand that a lot of these walls that are being put up are in fact just extremely important defense mechanisms. We can then partner with them and align with them and let them know that we're actually on their side. Maybe they might want to know about this hotline, or they might want to know about this resource, maybe for themselves, maybe for someone they know, maybe if they change their mind down the road. That is a huge step forward in putting information into their hands that they can then use to possibly leave their situation. As healthcare workers, the best thing we can do for victims of human trafficking is to provide trauma-informed care to all of our patients and to act as if every patient we see has experienced some form of trauma.
Dignity Health out west has done a tremendous amount of work in this area because they have a survivor who has advocated for that. So give them great props for that. Regardless of how many or how few resources you have, When you encounter indicators or symptoms that the patient communicates, document, document, document. Observation and documentation, these are your best legal tools to assist the victim. Now, some people are concerned that once they've had this training, they're going to be expected to interview victims. No, absolutely not. Unless you have had specific training, please leave the investigative work to appropriate agencies or personnel who are trained. You certainly can ask appropriate clinical questions, but you should never probe for the details of their trauma that actually can re-traumatize them. One thing we can do is use a survivor-informed approach, and these are suggestions from survivors. I'm not suggesting you need to use these specific statements, but when it is appropriate, attempt to communicate the sentiment. Listen to them. Are you just looking at your charting? Are you focusing on that digital screen in front of you? Don't just look at your patient, see them. In fact, look them in the eye. If you have a couple of seconds to just sit down and get on eye level and listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying. Let them know they matter. You may be surprised what a difference just that makes. Now, word of caution, communicating with victims is not always easy. As a result of what they're going through or have been through, it can be difficult to communicate with these individuals. And sometimes their coping mechanisms can make them even rather unpleasant to deal with. Try not to let that discourage you. Allow them to communicate in their language, using their vocabulary with as little or as much as they want to share. Again, don't probe. And don't try to correct them if they keep referring to someone you suspect is exploiting them or trafficking them. If they keep calling them their boyfriend, don't correct them, just let them share. If you know some of the basic terms in advance, and these are readily available online, I put the website there at the bottom at Shared Hope International, but you can find these anywhere. If you look these up and know these ahead of time, it really helps you allow the victims to just accept and listen to how they share their situation in their words. Of utmost importance is trying to assure the patient feels safe. Again, I keep talking about safety. You need to safely separate them from the person with them if at all possible. Now, obviously, don't do anything that would, put you at risk, but there are going to be different approaches that are appropriate in different settings. So get creative. These suggestions are just a few that might be for a medical setting, such as a physician's office, an emergency department, a clinic. Give them a task to do, the person with them. Give them a task to do, tell them they need to go fill out this form, whether they do or not. Tell them you need to take the patient to the bathroom to get a urine sample or to radiology for x-ray, whether you do or not. Again, just get creative. These are just a few things. Ideally, you really should designate a patient-only bathroom if you have that available, simply because it makes it easier to have private patient communications. And I realize that's not always possible. I do know of some clinics and physician offices where they use colored dots on urine samples, and they have a little sign that says, if you need help, put the green dot on your urine sample. I know some places have something like this in the bathroom. If you need help, tear off one of these tabs and hand it to a staff member. And if they are in a private bathroom, they can do that without anybody seeing them. There are now several screening tools for human trafficking, and these are just 3 that have been validated. But the challenge with many tools is they can take quite some time to administer. And some of these tools only apply to specific populations of patients or even specific types of screeners, like law enforcement or healthcare providers or social workers. The SIA tool is probably the most well-known and the most commonly used tool for sex trafficking, but it's somewhat lengthy and it only addresses sex trafficking. The RAF tool is a more recently developed and validated tool that is much shorter, and it's much easier to use in limited interaction settings, like an emergency department or an urgent care center or something like that. I won't go into more detail on specific tools because first they'll be organization-based and role-based, but also none should be utilized without training. Intervention-based tools are different than screening tools. These tools provide guidance on how to intervene and interact with patients and clients. Rather than trying to identify where there's an issue, it's just a guidance for interacting with victims and survivors. So anyone can use these. These are 2 very similar evidence-based tools. The PAIR tool, the one on the right, was developed by a survivor advocate in a healthcare system. Provide a safe private space. We've talked about the different ways to do that. Try to use non-judgmental education. What does that mean? Well, if you'd say to a patient, I need you to know about XYZ, oftentimes that can make them feel uncomfortable, like they've been singled out or they've been found out, and that may create fear. Instead, you can say something like, just to let you know, I educate all my patients on XYZ. And that is a little bit softer. It's not just them. You're saying something that you do for everyone. Ask. Try to allow time for them to ask questions and provide discussion. And I know, again, some of us have very brief interactions with patients, and extended conversations may not be possible, but regardless, always respect their response. If the patient declines to engage, respect that. It's certainly okay to ask. In fact, I would encourage you to ask, is there anything else you'd like to share? But then don't push, don't probe. That is part of empowering them. In fact, disclosure is not the goal. That's important. Disclosure is not the goal. We'll talk about that in just a moment. With interpreters, it's so tempting to just use the family member or the person with them, but we really just can't. In the hospital setting, we're required to have professional interpreters. But what if we're outside the hospital setting? What if you don't have that available? Just know what your protocol is. And sometimes it's simply a staff member who's trained in confidentiality and who's comfortable with sensitive topics. But know your protocol ahead of time so that you don't have to rely on that person with them. When you do communicate with an interpreter, use best practices, shorter, slower segments, speak slowly, maintain eye contact with your patient, not with the interpreter, and make sure the interpreter is free to interrupt you and advise you of any cultural issues or misunderstandings as well. So make sure, though, that you keep eye contact with your patient. Before we wrap up, let's talk about reporting. As healthcare professionals, of course, we're mandatory reporters by law. In fact, in Texas, all citizens are mandatory reporters, but professionals have additional guidelines. If you're reporting a case of suspected trafficking, obviously for minors, you're required to report to DFPS or CPS, as well as law enforcement. But use the words that will convey the level of your concern. In other words, if you're concerned it's potentially a case of trafficking, use that word. Sometimes using that word sends that case to a specific officer or even a specific task force. And with a minor, it will often expedite the case. So make sure you use those specifics. Mandatory is pretty clear for most of us, mandatory reporting. Reporting as needed, a little bit different. If they're between 18 and 16.4 and they're not disabled, well, reporting is still mandatory if there is an outcry, if they ask for help, or if they're clearly describing for you a situation where force, fraud, and coercion are evident. But keep in mind that many victims will not outcry or even consider themselves a victim. Don't try to convince them that they are. Contact law enforcement and ask to speak with someone who deals with trafficking cases. Other than emergency situations, it's really best to use non-emergency law enforcement numbers. I keep the non-emergency numbers for my county sheriff and my local PD in my phone. But again, use the appropriate phrasing. I'm concerned my patient or client is being trafficked or exploited, and specify whether you're talking about labor or sex and whether they're adult or minor, and share the reasons for your suspicions. And again, document really well. You generally won't need to call 911 unless you're in a non-medical setting outside of your work environment and you think someone's in immediate danger. And if you're in doubt, if you're not sure whether you should call 911, I always tell clinicians, always err on the side of your patient. If you're not sure, call 911 and they will relay you to the appropriate department. If you do need to involve law enforcement, there are some implications to be aware of when they get involved. First, victims are often told by their trafficker, law enforcement, they're just going to arrest you and lock you up. And in fact, victims not only may fear arrest, they may have already been arrested for things they were forced to do while being trafficked, what we call forced criminality. And there's more attention being paid now to forced criminality because we find that we're prosecuting victims for things that they were forced to do. For instance, maybe they were picked up for drug use, even when it's being forced on them. Maybe they were picked up for prostitution when it's actually trafficking. Or maybe they were picked up for being here undocumented or illegally. If they don't have access to their legal papers, all of those things may have happened. Re-traumatization of a victim is always a potential risk when law enforcement needs to be involved. If you have law enforcement officers who are used to dealing with victims, they will understand that and hopefully have some training. But law enforcement is like every other profession. You're going to have some who are better trained and some who are more compassionate than others. Just keep that in mind. You should also report to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Why? It's a national database for receiving calls and logging suspected trafficking cases. The hotline staff are particularly trained in what questions to ask, and they will often provide information to local law enforcement with what they find out. The other thing with hotline staff, they can sometimes track activity and connect dots on similar cases across multiple jurisdictions that would be a lot more difficult for law enforcement to know about. We had a case here in Texas where the hotline staff said, hey, this sounds a lot like the folks in Missouri. And sure enough, it was trafficking that was going on between here and St. Louis. If you are calling the hotline and do not have patient consent, you cannot disclose protected health info. They are still protected by HIPAA. What can you do? You can call them with hypotheticals, and you can request resources and guidance. You also can share information about the person accompanying them that if you think is exploiting them specifically, because they're not your patient and they're not protected by HIPAA unless releasing that information would identify the patient. Texas actually was the first state to develop a formal partnership with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The hotline also has victim resources. In addition to the toll-free number, they have a text number, they have web chat, and email options. And I have all this information in my contacts as well. And I will tell you that I have had the occasion to use the hotline number when out and about. Thinking about healthcare support services, who might be part of the team where you work? Who do you have access to? Do you have social workers or licensed counselors? Or do you have any trauma-informed staff? Ideally, you need a multidisciplinary team. Depends obviously on the size of your organization. For sex trafficking victims, do you have a rape crisis center that gets involved in these cases? Or do you know how to access sexual assault nurse examiners? What about other victim resources in your area? Maybe you have no idea. And if you don't, talk to a social worker or a licensed counselor, or maybe a case manager where you work. Or if there's a local human trafficking nonprofit close by in your region, call them. Also, the hotline staff, the hotline has an online referral directory with a zip code search. So you can put in your zip code online and it can help you find resources in your area as well. Know how to make a referral for victim services when needed, and who in your organization or practice is going to do that. If you happen to be in the Bexar County area, we take referrals at our nonprofit. But if you make these decisions and develop these partnerships with local groups in advance, it greatly expedites your victims getting the help they need, and it will save you a lot of time in the long run as well. This is a guide developed by a survivor that I just love, and it's designed specifically for healthcare interactions with suspected victims. Why don't we have more victims in the healthcare setting? Maybe we do, and we're just not identifying them. That is why the survivors that created this, they said the very first thing is believe them. I cannot tell you how many stories I have heard from survivors who finally got up the courage to outcry and were not believed. You may hear some crazy stories. Don't automatically write them off. Listen to them and believe them until proven otherwise. Only provide resources if they want help. Never put written information into their belongings without their permission. You could actually endanger them by doing that. Affirm them, give them a voice, listen without judgment, empower them by giving them options when possible, and certainly allow them to make their own choices. And sometimes that means choosing not to say anything. Most victims will not self-identify, will not outcry, and not be willing to accept help. And that is okay, as hard as that is for us. So let's wrap things up here. What is our role? Our role is to gain their trust and help them feel safe. I keep emphasizing the word safe for a reason. Remember, that is the key primary driving principle for trauma-informed care. Be observant, document well, report when necessary. That's just being a good clinician, isn't it? Do remember it's not your job to save the patient. What is our job? It's to create a safe and a trusting environment for them. It's our job to provide victim-centered care and to involve law enforcement when appropriate. And it's our job to know what our community resources are. Everything else, it's up to the patient. So what is success in this scenario? I don't want anybody to feel like you failed if you know something's wrong and they just won't disclose. You have not failed. What is most important? Whether or not that they have been receptive to your interaction, that you make them feel safe and welcome to return. And really, shouldn't we be doing that for just about everyone? Put a point on it. Success is not identification or even disclosure. Success is that people will have a positive experience in the healthcare setting and see it and us as a safe place to disclose if and when they are ready. This is such a tough topic that I always like to end with hope. And here's the proof. These individuals have managed not only to survive, but have found a way to thrive despite the horrendous trauma that they've experienced. I want to thank them for that. If you think of any questions after you leave here, feel free to email me. This is my email address, or you can certainly contact me through our website by contacting the organization. In fact, speaking of our website, Ransom Life Texas, I want to thank them as our partner who supports us in doing these lectures. If you're a parent or have minor children in your life and you'd like more information on how to educate either yourselves or those kiddos, you can go to the Knowledge Hub on our homepage. And we have information from several reputable resources, as well as some on-demand videos that are educational, both for adults, teachers, parents, and for kids, for minors. So it's a good place to explore. I want to end with a quote by Wilberforce, who was one of the primary movers of ending slavery in England. You may choose to look the other way. You never again can say that you did not know. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for allowing me to present to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody.